troubles. Reputations can be destroyed in a blink of an eye. The lives of Indian leaders can indeed be quite hard. Which is why Pradeep Chibar and Harsh Shah's compilation of wide-ranging interviews with 20 significant political figures is an important project. This is a project that helps us shed light on figures we think we are familiar with and of whom we actually don't know a lot. This is a project that helps us remember that regardless of what we think about politicians, love, fear, or even contempt, they still play a fundamental and indispensable role of mediation between citizens and the state and other forms of power. The role of mediation that politicians play, interceding in people's favor, listening to grievances, seeking to address them, addressing local issues, cannot be played by any other professional categories. Not by bureaucrats, who can at times be irresponsive or arbitrary in the way they deal with citizens, not by the media, who too often does not pay adequate attention to
इंदौर से मैं कह रहा था भी चौका मारा छक्का भी आपको मारना है और मध्य प्रदेश और बेहतर प्रदर्शन करता रहेगा.
A book that also reveals how deeply enmeshed most of these Gen X politicians, as we know them, are with contemporary policy debates about urbanization, about development, and how their reflections and actions are shaped by ideas rather than by merely political expediency. The book is also useful because the media frenzy that surrounds politicians does not always give them the time to pause, to reflect on the meaning of their vocation, on the purpose behind their political ambitions. And political scientists like Pradeep or I are prompt to, sometimes put politicians in well-defined boxes, thus eliminating their complexity, the nuance. And many of the people interviewed by the two authors surprised them with their candor, with their open-mindedness, with their ability to reflect on issues, to reflect on themselves, and also to not take themselves too seriously. And these are indeed qualities that strike you when you get to know netas a little bit more closely. What is also interesting, and perhaps this is something that our authors and our speakers today can elaborate on, is not just that there is a new generation of politicians that has emerged or that is emerging, but that they are emerging in a very different social and political context. Over the past few decades, political parties in India have undergone important transformations. They have become more centralized across the spectrum. Electoral campaigns have become more professionalized, data-driven, with modes of communications that connect party leaders and central party organizations directly to voters without the old mediation of local and traditional political elites. And similarly, today you cannot survive politically anymore by courting the votes of a specific segment of the electorate. Everyone must be all-encompassing, which also transpires from the conversations contained in the book. And this changing context has had an enormous impact on the definition of the scope of what politicians can or cannot do or achieve across the political board. So I really look forward to a conversation. I already expressed my thanks to Pradeep and Harsh for putting these interviews together, for enabling this discussion with two important political figures of our time. So we are also indeed very grateful for your presence. And before I leave the floor to Yamini, who will introduce the authors and our two main speakers, I would like to offer you a few ground rules for this discussion. So we will start with a small presentation of the book by Pradeep and Harsh, followed by a conversation between the authors and our two speakers. There will be space for questions from the audience, but in order to keep things orderly, we are requesting people to write down their questions in the chat box. These questions will be moderated by Aishwarya, an Ashoka student and collaborator at TCPD. Short and crisp questions will refer to long commentary, and in some cases, Aishwarya will club similar questions together. So thank you again for your presence. And on that note, I leave the floor to my colleague and friend, Yamini.
Thank you, Gilles, for that. And on behalf of the Center for Policy Research and the Trivedi Center for Political Data, Ashoka University, it's an absolute privilege for me to welcome all of you, our audience, and our very, very esteemed panelists and guests to today's discussion. I did want, Gilles has already given a very thoughtful introduction to the book, so I'm going to use my 5 minutes to offer some remarks from a policy perspective on why politics matters to a policy research institution. And in fact, we have over the last year, under the leadership of Rahul Verma, who's joined us here along with collaborations with Gilles, and now formally with Pradeep, who joins the center as a visiting faculty officially, I think, as of today, are beginning to look much more seriously at understanding politics, primarily because policy, the space of public policy, and in fact, the space of ideas for public policy, often look to politics not so much as an enabler of policies, as much as a resistor of policies. When technocrats come up with fine ideas that don't make their way into the world of policy and implementation, we throw up hands up in the air and say, there was no political will. And then we leave it to the political scientists, Gilles and Pradeep, to tell us under what conditions do politicians become reformers, under what conditions do politicians engage with ideas. When in fact, we as practitioners know on an everyday basis in our informal and formal interactions with politicians have a very live understanding of policy. They have a very live engagement with ideas, and I think this book really brings that out in very tangible ways, that in fact politicians are not the problem, they are very much part of the solution. And we have to be able to engage as people who are in the industry of ideas, people who engage in argumentation, who engage in the production of knowledge. We have to find better ways of engaging with politics, with the process of politics. And the first part of that is to better understand our politicians. If you look closely at every point in independent India's history, where we have seen significant transformations in policy that have significantly improved people's lives, it has always been because politicians are the reformers. Politicians are the key parts of, are the key drivers of change in India. And it is to our detriment as those who are in the world of ideas and those who engage in the technocratic elements of policy, not to better understand politicians and not to better engage with politics. So our work on politics at CPR is really an attempt at trying to bridge this gap. And I hope that this is the first of many more interactions with our esteemed panelists and other politicians to really bridge this gap so that we don't have the good old economist framing of good economics as bad politics. Actually, there can be no good policy if it doesn't make for good politics. And it's for both fields to bridge and start engaging in a much more robust dialogue with each other. Pradeep and Harsh's book is an important starting point to give us a deeper and more meaningful insight into the lives of politicians that goes beyond what Twitter tells you and what evening, nightly TV debates, or shall I say shouting matches, give us a sense of. It is only to enrich us that I hope we can continue with these conversations, and perhaps in a small way that the world of policy and policy research can also find a better contribution to the world of politics. So thank you very much for giving us your time. Thank you especially Pradeep and Harsh for this very important book and for giving us the opportunity to engage with what your book is teaching us and the insights it offers, and to Mr. Devendra Fadnavis and Mr. Milind Deora to join us today for this conversation. My panelists and our book authors need no introduction, but there are formalities even in the world of Zoom. So I'm going to go through those regardless. First, I must introduce the authors of this book today. Pradeep Chibber, who's a professor and Indo-American Community Chair in India Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and more importantly, visiting senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. And Mr. Harsh Shah, who's an MBA candidate at the Harvard Business School. Harsh, I will say, I've always been very envious of case studies that MBA students get to learn from. And I'm very glad that we are now getting to apply these case study methods to different disciplines and also the practice of policy. And we will begin, as Gilles said, with a brief introduction to the book by Pradeep and Harsh, followed by a conversation with our esteemed panelists, Mr. Devendra Fadnavis, the former Chief Minister of Maharashtra, and Mr. Milind, Deora, former Union Minister of State, Government of India. It's really particularly exciting as we hear this conversation to have an opportunity to learn about what it means to govern a state and what it means to be a minister at the center, because those federal interfaces are also so crucial to the experience of the actual practice of policy that I think we rarely get the opportunity to engage with and learn from. So really looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us here. And on behalf of CPR and TCPD Ashoka University, look forward to the conversation. Over to you, Pradeep.
Thank you, Yamini. Thank you, Mr. Fadnavis, Milind, Deora. Thank you, Gilles, and thank you, Rahul, and the CPR team, as well as TCPD and all those who are attending. This has been a long and, shall we say, mildly a labor of love in generating this book. And essentially the idea was, as Gilles put it very nicely, that for a very long time, academic discourse in India has been dominated by a very particular understanding of who politicians are and what they do. But when you speak to politicians on a daily basis, their own lives are a lot more hectic and a lot more constrained and a lot more challenging than we give them credit for, and how they manage to work through those challenges is something we were interested in finding out. There's also a belief that there is political expediency drives everything. And when we were speaking with many of these politicians, we realized that it's not only political expediency, but it's also that many of these politicians are careful, thoughtful individuals with deep and insightful perspectives on many aspects of Indian life. And that you don't get to be a political leader of any stature in India by just being a gadfly. But more than that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Harsh, who's actually been using all the skills he's learning in management schools, not only to talk about the book, but to also market and promote the book. So Harsh, thank you so much, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Professor Chibber, and thank you, Mr. Fadnavis, Mr. Deora, Gilles, Yamini, Rahul, and the entire CPR team. I don't have much to add to what Professor Chibber said, but what I will say is that we get a chance to see a lot of the politicians featured in this book, but we don't really get a chance often to understand what really, who is the person behind the persona or the public persona that we get to see. And really in this book, we've tried to really peel off that veneer and get a sense of who these people are, what drives them, what motivates them, and most importantly, to challenge a lot of the lazy perceptions that the general public often have of these politicians. That they're lazy, they don't work hard, they're this or that. I think this book allowed us to really go deep into understanding through a pretty wide and representative sample, though not an exhaustive one, who are the change makers, potential change makers in India, but more importantly, who are the personalities that will often be leading this country and hopefully potentially bridge that gap between policy and politics and its implementation, as Yamini alluded to. So I hope you enjoy this book. I think Professor Chibber and I really enjoyed it. Enjoyed these interactions. All of the interviews we did were in person, about an hour and a half long. Of course, it involved a lot of struggle, a lot of scheduling conflicts, a lot of pain, but it has in many ways been a labor of love. And we hope you find something, find a lot of value in it. And I hope you've learned something a lot with it as well. Jill, I think you're on mute.
Yes, thank you, Harsh. And so to start the conversation between you, Mr. Fadnavis, and you, Milind, let me just put on the floor 2 questions, which you are entirely free to address, either of them, or not address at all, and pick up the conversation from wherever you like. The first question is really about the job description of a politician. So we know that politicians divide they divide their job between the role of legislator, the formal aspect, of the job, what they have formally been, elected to, and also everything else that they do around constituency service. And we know that for most politicians, in any case, constituency service seem to take up, most of their time, and the legislative aspect seem to come a little bit on the side. And that has also to do with the systemic constraints that wait, the pressures to build up contact, to maintain a presence, and to also up the chances of actually being re-elected, right? So we have data that quantifies the fact that political careers in India for most politicians is extremely short. It's about 1 term, and in certain states it's actually on average shorter than a term. Most politicians in India don't last. The cost of entry into politics is extremely high. It is a highly competitive profession. Most elected representatives don't serve more than 1 term, or they're quickly replaced either by voters or by their own parties. Competitive pressures also lead parties to hire a lot of local political mercenaries who check all the boxes of winnability, often at the cost of party loyalty. And that translates into all sorts of practices that harm the quality of representation that citizens get. Turncoats, predatory behavior, governments, falling through various, practices after the election has taken place. And the rules of the game also heighten the barriers to entry to all sorts of categories of aspiring politicians, notably women who, I regret to say, did not find representation in our panel, despite the author's efforts. But it translates into assemblies of newcomers that don't have a lot of incentives to learn the ropes of parliamentary work. Mr. Ovaisi makes that very clear in his interview in the book. So the question is, what can be done to improve the quality of representation that citizens get? Not so much from the angle of constituency service, because I think most politicians actually do get that covered, but more on the legislative aspect. How do we address the inbuilt incentives that contribute to attract certain bad apples into the system without harming anybody's right to contest for office, right? And parallel to that, what can be done to restore the role of parliaments? What are the incentives to learn the job of a legislator when even parliamentary committees are not allowed to meet, or where the parliament is disrupted? The few surveys that exist about the work of legislators point to the fact that constituency service matters far more than legislative work, and for all sorts of good reasons. But as a result, we seem to have parliaments that become more and more dysfunctional. We seem to be getting a quasi-presidential system, but without the counterpowers necessary to tame the power of the executive. So how do we restore balance between legislative, executive branch, and how do individual politicians can also restore balance between their legislative duties and the work that they do in service of people in their constituency? So maybe we could start it from there, perhaps with you, Mr. Fadnavis, and then we will give time to Milind to respond and share his views. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. At the outset, let me first congratulate Professor Pradeep and Harsh for this wonderful book, and also the team of CPR, because I think it's not just a book which expresses the feelings of politicians or the way they have developed themselves, but I think it's also new generation dialogue. So a lot of things come out of these conversations. I could read a few. I haven't read each and every page of this book, but I've read a few, and I think it has come out wonderfully. So maybe right now I'm traveling. Once I finish my travel, I wish to read the entire book and get the perspective of each and every politician and their life journey as well. Now, coming back to your question, see, when I first became a legislator in 1999, when I was elected to the Legislative Assembly, there was one session where actually legislative tools were taught to us. There was one session organized, and Mr. Ram Naik, who was former union minister and right now he retired as a governor of Uttar Pradesh, he told me or all of us a very good mantra. He said, whenever you are in constituency, just think about legislature, about your legislative work. So what all you experience, what all you interact, and what all problems you confront, everything you look at it from the perspective of giving that a legislative solution. So whenever you are in a constituency, you think about legislature, and whenever you are in legislature, think about your constituency. So while you are in legislature, when you think about your constituency, you will also raise those particular points which are absolutely important for your constituency, and so that will help you getting re-elected, and vice versa. When you are in your constituency, ultimately as a representative, when you legislate, you must know the feelings of people, you must know the aspirations of the constituents. They may be representative, but state at large, I think they are same. So I think with that mantra, now I've been elected for 5 times, and I think that mantra has worked a lot. So I am one person who always says that I have been elected in my constituency constantly, continuously for 5 times because of my legislature work or my legislative work. And secondly, for past, I think all my stints in the Legislative Assembly, in my just first term, I was awarded as the best legislator by the Parliamentary Association, CPA. So I think that you can balance it, and I think that is most helpful. So there is nothing like choosing either or. No, both coexist and both complement each other. Secondly, you have rightly said that there are times when we find that politicians or parliamentarians are more interested in disrupting assemblies or parliament. I think there are 2 aspects to that. Right now, all the politics, including legislative or parliamentary work, is more guided by media.
Mm-hmm.
And normally, I mean, I don't want to blame it on media, but normally a debate which lasts for 2 days gets 2 columns in a newspaper, but a disruption of assembly or disruption of parliament gets a banner line. An entire half page is devoted to that. Or if you look at the electronic media, it becomes talk of the day, it becomes the debate of the day. So I think that, I will never support that, because I am one person who feels that by disrupting the legislature or parliament, you don't achieve anything. Mm-hmm. But by debate, if you are in opposition, you can pinpoint the shortcomings of ruling party. And so I think that debates are more important. However, there are certain occasions where disruptions are also used as parliamentary tool. So I think occasionally, once or twice, that is also important, because that shows the importance of that subject. But if you do it often, then I think you are not doing justice to your parliamentary work.
Thank you. So, Milind, do you agree with that? That this is basically like a false dichotomy? So, in your experience, formally as a parliamentarian, that the constraints of the ground sort of trumps your ability to function as a legislator. And just to segue, also, I believe that you also have questions of your own that you would like to offer to Mr. Fadnavis and vice versa. So I'm going to leave the floor to both of you to do that.
So, well, thank you, Gilles, and thank you, CPR, Yamini, and the team for hosting us. I'm again, I would also like to congratulate my very dear friends, Professor Chibber and Harsha, for putting together, as Professor Chibber called it, a labor of love. And I've had the good fortune of knowing both of them for some time now. I've had the good fortune and opportunity to visit both of them in Berkeley more than once when Harsh was an undergraduate student over there. And I'm glad they've put this book together. In my experience of being a politician, and when I first got elected in 2004, and I was 27 years old at the time, there were a lot of books, discussions, debates, features on young MPs. And it so happened that in 2004, there was a new crop of young leaders cutting across party lines who had in some ways evinced a lot of media interest and perhaps even public interest. And so when Harsh and Professor Chibber told me about this book, I'm like, oh no, one more book on younger politicians. But in 2004, we were in our 20s. This book has obviously reached now, gone up to the age of 50. And I think a very big differentiator in India tomorrow and everything else that has been written and said in the past is that this book has tried to humanize politicians. I think Professor Chibber and Harsh have stepped aside as curators and has allowed people like Devendra ji and myself to speak our minds. And I was reading even Devendra ji's interview, which was fascinating to learn about his background, his start. His father was in politics. There are many similarities that he and I have, for instance, in politics. We both have a political background. He, of course, started at a very local level as a municipal corporator in the Nagpur Municipal Corporation at a very young age. Many people know Devendra Fadnavis as the chief minister of the second largest, most industrial state in India. But perhaps people don't know that he started out at a local level. And his politics has essentially been local and regional between Nagpur and Maharashtra. Mine, on the other hand, has really been more, I guess you could call it more national, between Mumbai and Delhi. But I think to Devendra ji's point, the question you asked, Gilles, it's a very tricky issue. And I think the example that Devendra ji, you highlighted about Shri Ram Nayak advising you about how to manage local with regional is something I remember I always struggled with, at least in my early days. How do you balance local with national? Because what I found was when I got elected in 2004, I thought that I knew that it was part of a national movement, a national wave, if you will. I understand that there are national sentiments at play, especially in a parliamentary election. But people also had local expectations from you. And when I would do my constituency rounds, go for programs, inaugurate MP fund work, etc., people were really asking me about the gutter on the street, the flooding, the water in their taps, their house gullies and the drainage lines, which were built by the British in South Mumbai. And meanwhile, I was trying to sort of struggle between focusing on local issues and concerns, and at the same time, express myself on national issues. And I think that is an interesting conundrum that politicians, not just in India, but in any democracy face. A very good friend of mine who's a senator in the United States, he always tells me, he said, sometimes when we go back to our state and we're doing these town hall meetings, somebody suddenly comes and taps me on the shoulder and says, I just got a parking ticket and can you help me with that? But at the same time, they have to also talk about the war in Iraq and the country's foreign policy. And those bring about challenges. Those are interesting issues at the same time, because I think a politician ultimately a legislator whether you're a MLA like Devendra ji is or an MP like I was, you have to try and balance local aspirations with regional or national aspirations. And it's a tricky subject. I wouldn't say that I perfected it when I demitted office in 2014. But I think to Devendra ji's point, the media has an interesting role to play. And I would just like to add to one point. I remember Devendra ji in 2005 when I had a chance to initiate the debate in the Lok Sabha on the Right to Information Bill, and which was a historic opportunity for me because I was, as I said, only 27 at the time. And, the RTI was, of course, a game-changing legislation. And it had been a legislation which existed in some states, including Maharashtra. But for the first time, it was being legislated at a national level. And I do recall that when I looked up at the media benches during my speech, I saw maybe in a media hall, in a media, the area for the news media, where typically in Lok Sabha, you could seat about maybe 50 to 70 journalists. I saw maybe 3 or 4 journalists during that debate. And similarly, I've noticed many a times that when there was a disruption happening or something very controversial happening or question hours going to be disrupted, you had the media gallery packed with journalists. And whether we like to admit it or not, unfortunately, that does affect and influence political outcomes. And that obviously then in turn has a huge impact on political outcomes. So in my view, Gilles, I think democracy in India and democracy around the world is certainly a work in progress. I think if I look back at it, I think India has done considerably well in 70 years. In some ways, when I look at what's happening in the United States today, I mean, they're more third world in their politics than we are in a way. We've kind of become more of a first world nation in terms of how we conduct our politics, and they've moved back, or whichever way you want to look at it, in spite of being the oldest democracy in the world. But I do believe that there have been great advancements, and I think RTI, again, when UPA and Congress was in power, was a great move. I think when NDA and Vajpayee ji was prime minister, the legislation which allowed for or which ensured and mandated that every candidate fighting any election had to provide 3 pieces of information to the public: their criminal record, their educational qualifications, and their assets and liabilities. I think that too was a game changer, and that put power in the hands of the people. I think our democracy certainly isn't perfect, and no democracy is perfect, and there are going to be many challenges going forward. But I do believe that India has made considerable strides in the last few decades, and there's a lot going for us in that sense. If I can take this conversation forward, and coming back to my point about you, Devendra ji, since when Harsh told me about this conversation and he said you're going to be part of it, and I asked him, is it a moderated conversation? And as you and I are used to, many moderated discussions, which you typically have a political journalist who comes and moderates these conversations. I immediately jumped in and said, Harsh, would it be okay if Devendra ji and I have a conversation together and we talk as friends? That the reason I said that, very honestly, not to flatter you, is because I've had very, very high regards for you for a long, long time. And although I never met you, I remember the first time I met you was in 2014 during a Times Now debate during the elections. But your reputation preceded you, because from 99, when you first became a legislator, you had built a reputation for yourself as a master orator, as a master legislator, someone who could hold the government accountable, and someone, frankly, who commanded, I think, forgive me for saying this, more respect from the opposition parties, maybe even than you did from your own party. and sometimes I had so many Congress MLAs who would come to me and say, and even when you were chief minister, that, Devendra ji is an amazing chief minister, our work gets done very quickly. And I think that to me was fascinating. And I found that very, very interesting, because it in some ways reminded me of my father, who started like you, wherein he always told me that before he died, that, Milind, you were very lucky that at the age of 27, you could become an MP and you could go straight to the highest level of pillar of democracy. And a temple of democracy, versus himself, who had to become a municipal councillor, then a mayor, then an MLA, then an MLC, and then an MP and a union minister. And I would just like to ask you, Devendraji, as I said, that I don't know if many people know that in your early 20s, you became a municipal councillor from the city of Nagpur. And I wanted to ask you if that was inadvertent, if that was deliberate, if that was planned, if you aspired to become an MLA first or an MP first, but it just happened by accident. The reason I ask you that is because, funnily enough, in 2004, when I became an MP, I was actually very keen to fight the 2002 municipal elections. I thought, I felt very passionately about Mumbai, and I felt that the best forum to serve is actually as a corporator. So I really wanted to know from you why you chose local politics.
Thank you, Milind. Frankly speaking, I never thought that I will be a politician. So I was working as a student leader, and I just entered a university, and we started fighting the university elections and doing all sort of stuff. And at that time, my aspiration was to work as a student leader and to work in a student field for maybe 4 or 5 years. I also wanted to become a full-time worker of Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, ABVP. And that was my dream. I never wanted to come to politics. But somehow, my mentors and those people who used to guide me, they one day told me that, look, we feel that you should start working for BJP. And I said, I don't want to go to politics. But they said, no, we have decided that you have to go. And, I come from RSS and we follow what our mentors tell us. So I started working for BJP. And you'll be surprised that when I was told, and I started as a ward president, and I was told that you have to fight the election of corporation. And I said, yes. And then I only knew that my age was actually not 21 years complete that time. So if the election,
you couldn't become a
I couldn't. So right. that was a problem. But
there's a minimum age for becoming.
Yeah, that's a minimum age. But thanks to the 74th Amendment, and the elections were postponed by 6 months, and I became eligible. I completed 21 years, and I got elected. And then that journey started, because see, I have a very focused mind. Whatever I do it with total focus. So when I entered the corporation, for 5 years, I worked very passionately. And when I got elected again, and we had enough numbers, so I was a natural choice, because only 8 of us were second time elected. All the others, 64 people, we got elected in a house of 125. All of them were first timers. So I was a natural choice to become a mayor.
Yeah,
so
right.
it's all destiny, I would say. Of course, hard work is there, but I am a person who never thought that I will ever enter politics. I entered politics when I became corporator. I never thought that I'll become mayor. When I became mayor, I never thought I'll become MLA. When I became MLA, I never thought I'll become chief minister or a minister at all. So,
right.
So I mean, that was a kind of journey which.
So destiny's child.
Yeah, absolutely. But one thing I would like to tell you, that when I started my public life, I think I thought that it's a profession where you can really make a change. It's not like just pointing fingers. It is you who have to deliver. And I think that made a lot of difference. So I'm very happy with my journey. I think although a lot of things I could not do, a lot of things I must do, but I think I'm very happy with my journey. Having said that, Milind, I would also like to ask you one question.
Sure.
I mean, see, I know you, and I've seen you for many years, and you, like your father, Murli Bhai, you also have friends everywhere. But you were elected from South Mumbai, and South Mumbai is one constituency which has most inequality in terms of wealth, in terms of everything.
Sure.
So it's very difficult. I mean, you have the high net worth people like the global citizens, or the richest people in Asia and world, and like that. and also total people who are absolutely, who don't have anything, the have-nots who even do not have a place to live in slum. I mean, they are living on a nala, or they are living on a platform, or on a railway line. So I mean, with such diversity, I mean, it must have been very difficult to connect to people. And you were the minister, so by becoming a minister again, it gives you a profile which is very high, and a union minister at the age of 27. So how could you manage to connect these two ends?
No, you're right, Devendra, because South Mumbai people, the perception sometimes for people who don't know Mumbai and Maharashtra, especially in Delhi, late Jaswant Singh ji used to call my father the MP from Manhattan. He used to say, because the perception outside of Mumbai is that South Mumbai is basically Haji Ali, Pedder Road, Marine Drive and Nariman Point. And that is, as you said, the sort of haves part of South Mumbai. But the minute you move east, you see people living in slums, which is the bulk of the constituency. In South Mumbai, for instance, people living in old chawls, which is what they call Girangaon, which was built during the time for the Girni Kamgars, the textile mill workers. And not just economically, Devendraji, but even socially, linguistically, it's very, very different. You have a pocket like, Umar Khadi and Mumba Devi, which is very, very Muslim dominated. There is a Bohri dominated area. There is a non-Bohri dominated area. There is a very strong, Kokani Maharashtrian area in Lalbagh, Parel. Girgaon has a very different flavor, which is a very, very different, more of people from my mother's community, which are like Karade Brahmins and others. And then you have, so it was a struggle, because what used to happen is my typical rounds on a Sunday, for instance, if I had a program on a Sunday, let's say an area like Kaf Parade or very close to Varsha in Malabar Hill, you would go to a slum called Prem Nagar, and you would have donated maybe 50 lakh rupees from your MP fund for a water connection. And then you go there and you're welcome there, you speak there. My Marathi is obviously not as good as yours, but I would pull off a little bit of Marathi and then you speak in Hindi. And then my workers and others would arrange a program right next door, which would be a group of, let's say, Darya Mahal, close to that, which was, English speaking, very affluent people. And what would happen is you would inaugurate the slum and you would say, we're here to help you. And then you would go to the other place and they would complain about the slum. And you had to find ways to actually create commonality for everybody. And I think that was a challenge, but that was a great opportunity and something I really enjoyed, because I enjoyed bringing both the communities together, and I saw it as two different communities. And this was true of when I went to Kaf Parade, where there are big slums and towers. So South Mumbai in that sense is a very, very diverse area, wherein 1 minute at 10 a.m. you could be in a program where the primary issue is water in our taps, and no pipeline and no door-to-door connection. We have to go and get water from a particular area. And then 1 hour later at 11 a.m. you could be speaking to a community who were questioning me, I remember, about the Indo-US nuclear agreement. And so in a sense, Devendraji, you had to be aware of every issue. You had to be well versed with what the BMC and municipality is doing, what the state government is doing at a Mahada level, and what the government of India is doing. But when you said that everything happened to you by chance, and not only electoral politics, but even getting into mainstream party politics and then becoming a municipal councillor at 21, then mayor and then MLA. Do you feel that as, when you became a chief minister, and how much did being a corporator, serving at a local level and even being mayor, help with, in terms of not just legislative and local experience dealing with a bureaucracy, but even executive experience?
No, I think it helps you a lot. No, I always used to say while talking to all corporators, I used to say कि जिसने पिछले जन्म में पाप किया वो कॉर्पोरेटर बनता है और जिसने महापाप किया वो महापौर बनता है. So because as a corporator you are accountable for every single thing. I mean it's one of the most demanding job, right from a light to gutter to sewer, every single thing. And people feel ownership over you. I mean, while talking to a MLA or a MP, at least they will have some respect. But many times I've seen that people find so much ownership on a corporator that they feel that he is a real servant and he has to serve. So I think I could learn a great deal being a corporator and also being a mayor. The city administration and I think my tenure as a mayor actually gave me a lot of experience into urban administration. So I think I love urban administration, although later on when I become an MLA, I had all rural areas. So I got connected with the rural areas, and my roots are also because my family comes from a small village. So we have still our farms there. We are basically agriculturists, so farmers. So I think those roots were always there. But I think with this, ground reality, which you really interact day in and day out, that helps you a lot, because ultimately, when you make a policy, if you have a direct connection with the aspirations of people, or if you know how people think and what people want, I think that helps you a lot. So I think that is.
But would you say now that I would agree with you 100%. I've not been a corporator, but I think that the corporator's life is it's a very difficult life, because the first person you call is the corporator, then you will escalate it to the MLA, then to the MP. And so the MP already meets people who've been filtered out by the MLA and the corporator. But do you feel now that you've done local politics, you have great experience of Nagpur and of a municipality. You've been an MLA now, Devendraji, for 20 years?
Yeah.
20. Do you feel like, so because I was hearing Gilles in his initial comments, and Yamini as well, that politics, as we know, like law, is an ocean. It's like music. There's 30 things you can do in it. You can be in party politics, you can be in the center, state, regional. Do you feel ever that you now have done 20 years of state, you've done local, you want to go national, you feel while your party is in power, you have a government in the center, would that be of interest to you?
Eventually, it would interest me, because I've always felt that there has to be a bigger canvas. But as of now, I think I'm more interested in the politics of state, because I'm more relevant here. As of now, I don't see my relevance in the national politics. Maybe eventually, when my party thinks, I would be more relevant there. But right now, I think I want to spend a few more years in the state politics. And maybe, I always feel whatever, responsibility you get, you can work with that responsibility. But having said that, being a chief minister had been quite a journey for me, because the amount of transformation you can do as a chief minister, that may not be sufficient. I mean, people may expect more, but I think that is very satisfying. Day in and day out, you take decisions, and those decisions change the lives of people. You can change the lives of people. You can make them more easy. You can create infrastructure. You can create schemes that empower the have-nots. So I think that has something which I feel that I should be doing more, not just by being a chief minister. I can do it also as a leader of opposition by keeping a tab on government. So as of now, I have no plans to go to central. I want to stay here.
But because not only from a personal choice, because now your party has made you in charge of the Bihar elections, which are likely to happen soon. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's the first big national role for you.
Yes.
In your political career. But the reason I asked you that question also, Devendraji, is not only from an experience point of view, but also that your party has been in power in Maharashtra in the state government really twice, in 94 to 99 and 2014 to 19. And of course, in 94 to 99, you were the junior partner with Shiv Sena, and 14 to 19, you were the senior partner. And Shiv Sena, on the other hand, has been in power three times now, if you include this government also. When you came to power in 14 to 19, I do remember, in spite of not being in state politics, I remember for 15 years when Congress was in power from 99 to 2014, I would hear about a lot of problems sometimes, and there are natural problems with a coalition partner. But I think you managed to go through a very stable alliance, but a very, if I can say, a very bumpy and turbulent alliance also. And where there was a lot of, the government was never shaky. Nobody thought that the government was shaky, but from an outside point of view, there was a lot of noise coming in. Was that, so that challenge never made you feel that I've had enough with the state, I want to go to the center?
No, I don't think so. Ultimately, you are absolutely right that for 5 years, although it was quite smooth, but it was quite turbulent as well. So right. Many times I used to feel that why this is happening. I mean, when we are taking good decisions and when the other party, which shares power, is also trying to put itself in the opposition space. It's trying to gather both the spaces, which I think was not good. So I thought, but then after sometimes you come to terms. So I came to terms and I said, okay, let's keep that aside. I will go on doing what I want. And mostly, I have managed my cabinet in such a way that all my decisions, despite what was the perception outside, all my decisions in my cabinet were unanimous, and there was not a single occasion where I decided to take a decision and my coalition partner could stop me. So ultimately, I had to work more. I had to do some, backdoor things for that, some meetings and some, conversations. But having said that, I would say that had it been a single party government, things would have been better, things would have been faster. Some tough decisions which you want to take, because the party who's a minor partner doesn't want to take the ownership of tough decisions. They want to take the ownership of populist decisions. But ultimately, when it comes to tough decisions, then they want to shy away from that, and they don't want to be the party to that. Or maybe they want to put all burden on you. So that slows down the pace a little bit. But I think otherwise I don't think that there was any problem. And in Maharashtra, and also for many years in the national politics, I think putting parties together was a big task for the person who was heading the coalition government, whether it was Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji, or whether it was Deva Gowda ji, or whether it was Manmohan Singh ji, or even for that matter, to some extent Narsimha Rao ji, because he also had to manage people. But I think both has its advantages and disadvantages. But I still feel that if the government is stable, then it is able to take tough decisions, and we need tough decisions.
But would you say, Devendra, coming to a point about coalition politics, and I mean, I actually didn't want to talk about politics. I wanted to focus on individual issues and concerns and views on politics. But how do you see coalition politics evolving going forward? Because frankly speaking, nobody could have ever imagined, and I say this even though my party is part of this coalition in Maharashtra, that Shiv Sena and Congress will come together. And I'm sure maybe even you would have never imagined that.
Never.
But you know, it's politics is funny, because back in the day when Congress was the largest party and the center of Indian politics revolved around Congress, we pushed all the regional parties and other parties with very differing ideologies to come together, including the Jan Sangh at the time.
Correct.
And so that tends to happen. But how do you see coalition politics evolving in Maharashtra and India?
See, as of now, if you look at the national scenario, fortunately, I think 2014 and 2019 have been the great years where a single party under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi ji has come to power. But in different states, I think the coalition politics is still there. And I think it will go on because, you know, in Indian polity, the regional parties have their own roles. And in fact, there are certain issues which the regional parties can handle, can highlight, or can take up, which the national parties cannot, because, you know, you have to, like Congress or BJP, these parties have to think nationally. So while being, keeping the regional identity intact, we cannot compromise with the national identity. But the best thing available with the regional parties is that they have to just, they have to protect the regional identity. So
Right.
I think for at least 10, 20 years, the regional parties are going to stay, and this politics of coalition will be there. But I think at least it should not go to bad to worse, because as of now, it's not just a political statement, but I mean, I can say it here because I know, Milind, you have been one person who has spoken what he felt. You have always been voicing a dissent, because whenever you felt that it's wrong, you have talked about that. So I think as of now, this coalition in Maharashtra is absolutely unnatural. It's absolutely unnatural. And we can feel the heat. You know, there is no cohesiveness. Three different parties are acting. I mean, when there was only Congress and NCP, at least there was some cohesiveness. There was some decision making. But now three parties are going in three different directions. Absolutely. So I think such type of coalition, I mean, I'm not against coalition politics. I'm not against regional parties, but such type of coalition can never take your state forward. So it's it's my thought. I don't know, what do you think about that? So maybe you can have a different point of view.
No, I think Devendra ji, that that what is, as I said, that I mean, to be very candid with you, I think I really believe that when I go through history, and back in the days in the 70s when Congress was very, very powerful and all encompassing, the earlier avatar of your party, the Jan Sangh, also did things which it would never have thought of doing today, frankly. And so that tends to happen with politics, because politics, as we say, is the art of the possible. You have to find a way to sometimes to keep your opponent out. So I think that it's clear that Congress, NCP, and Shiv Sena coming together in Maharashtra is very, very unique. There's no doubt. I think Congress and Chandrababu Naidu and TDP in Andhra Pradesh coming together is unique also. I don't say that, but I think that these are the sort of compulsions of politics, and these kind of alliances and coalitions, I think, will happen as long as your party is strong. And so I think you have to be prepared for disruptions in that sense, where things that seemed impossible, I think, can become possible. But moving away from this, Devendra ji, one other issue I wanted to ask you, since again you've been in politics longer than I have, and in my experience of 16 years of this profession, I've seen one massive change in politics, which is an unwelcome change. It's something which makes me feel very sad. When I got into politics in 2004, and very frankly, I remember there was a quote by Lyndon Johnson, who was the former US president, and he said, "I'm a free man, an American, a United States senator, and a Democrat, in that order. So first, I'm a free man. I can walk the earth as a free man. Then I'm a American. Then I'm a senator. Then I'm a member of the party." And in some ways, that was my philosophy towards politics. And in many ways, it still remains my philosophy towards politics. I think that life is too short to be pigeonholed into just one particular viewpoint. And sometimes ideologies need to change, they need to refresh themselves. And different people are taking different things from politics. I think that, so for someone like me, I went into politics very honestly to serve, to really to make a change, to do something. And I really would try my best in those initial years of being an MP to bring people together. You know, I remember once, I must tell you a story that once when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, and I still remember Praful Patel, who was the Civil Aviation Minister at the time, and he and I were flying, we just happened to be on the flight from Mumbai to Delhi for Parliament. And he was on the window seat, I was on the aisle seat, and I saw him looking out of the window. And when we took off and looking at the Mumbai airport, and then when we passed through Navi Mumbai, looking at the Navi Mumbai airport and explaining to me what's happening. And he was very passionately speaking about what's going on and what we need to do and what the state government needs to do, what the central government. And I asked him, I said, you know, I'm very worried about Mumbai airport because it's now, that time aviation was growing, the economy was doing very well. And I said that very soon we'll be over capacity, and when are we going to have this Navi Mumbai airport functional and operational? And he said there is an issue with regards to the central government, and there's some issue going on, some environmental concerns. And I remember I arrived into Parliament, I attended the session, and I went to Central Hall in Parliament, and I quickly rounded up a group of MPs from different parties. I remember I spoke to Sanjeev Naik from NCP, who was Navi Mumbai MP. And I spoke to a few MPs from your party, from Shiv Sena. And we created a group of about 12 or 15 MPs. We just called ourselves MMRDA MPs Forum. And we went and met Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and said, you know, we are coming here as people cutting across parties. We are from the Mumbai MMR region. And we are urging you to please push through this project as soon as possible. It's very important infrastructure project. And I feel that today, that kind of politics of cutting across the aisle and, you know, reaching out to your opponent for the larger, greater good, is that space is shrinking. And that is something which worries me. And I see this not in India only, I see this in the United States, I see this in Europe, where politics has become very extreme. And in some ways, you know, earlier religion used to divide people, but now ideology has become the new divisive factor. And, you know, people are just so divided and opinionated about ideology. And they either love this leader or they hate this leader, and they love this leader or they hate that other leader. And that middle ground, which was the largest space, was the middle ground. But today the middle ground has shrunk in global politics. And is that something that worries you? Is that something that you feel we can, you know, I mean, when I say we, not just people like you and I, because I know you share that view, but do you think that is something where BJP, Congress, other parties can come together and rise above for the greater good of the country and humanity?
No, Milind, I totally agree with you. You know, there's absolutely has been a shrinkage in the space. And I mean, I've also seen, you know, 15, 20 years back, or even at the time when my father was also into public life, you know, there was no political untouchability. Right now, we can see absolute untouchability. I mean, still the situation in Maharashtra is quite good. Still, you know, people who talk to each other can talk to each other. But I can see in some southern state or northern states,
True.
They are real enemies. I mean, how can that be? I think in politics we have seen that you know, even I have experienced as a legislator from opposition that many times I have myself done that I could come down heavily on a minister that this is wrong, that is wrong, that is wrong. And then after that, the minister inviting me to his chamber for lunch, and I have gone and taken lunch with him. And we had a discussion on lunch, and he could talk to me that, you know, what should we do? And these are our difficulties. Now, I think that is absolutely shrinking. And that's very worrisome. You know, ultimately we may have ideologies, we may have different policies, we may have different thinking processes, but we must understand that all of us are working towards one goal. There's not a single party which would say that we don't want development of India, or we don't want development of our people. So if all of us are working in the same direction, then we may have different ideologies, but we are not enemies. So, I mean, like Atalji used to say, that we are opponents, we are political opponents, but we are not enemies. Right now, we could see no political opponents, we could see political enemies. And that is, I think, very worrisome. We need to work on that. And
but why do you think that's happened in India and globally, Devendraji? What is your take on it?
It's absolutely, it has happened in India, it has happened globally. And I think, each one of us needs introspection. I mean, it's not about this group or that group or this party or that party. All of us together as a community, who are into politics or who are into public space, I think all of us need to do some introspection, because there's not you just cannot pinpoint a single person who is responsible. If this deterioration has happened, eventually all of us are responsible, and all of us together can only make it good. So I think people like you, people like me, who are known to be people from mid path, it's our responsibility. I've seen you doing such wonderful things. I mean, I may change the discussion a little bit, but I've seen that in these COVID times, despite, I mean, as of now, you did not have any responsibility as a public servant or a part of government, but you created such beautiful COVID centers, and you tried to help people. I think this is a style of working which all of us need to do. We are not just people who are working for A or B, but we are responsible to people at large. And I think it's our responsibility to do something which is worthwhile.
Thank you for that compliment, Devendraji. On coming on COVID, if I can maybe the last question, if Harsh and before the moderators want to jump in. I think it's important because we are both from Maharashtra, and Maharashtra has obviously been the hotspot for COVID. And you also lived in Mumbai for a long time. I live here. I've represented Mumbai. One thing I've observed, Devendraji, and this is actually, you're the right person to ask, because you've been chief minister, you've been a mayor of a city, of a major city in Maharashtra and India also. What do you think is inherently wrong with the BMC, with the municipality? And how do you think we can reform it to a stage where today we saw what happened largely because COVID was a magnifying glass on the BMC's problems. Tomorrow it could be a flood. Day after it could be something else. And I have often, broken my head on trying to understand what are the reforms needed. One thing I've always thought of, and I don't know if you agree with this or disagree, and I hope it's not something which is politically sensitive that we cannot admit to, or even if we agree with it. One thing I've always thought of, and I thought that, Mumbai is today, it's still one of the greatest cities in the world. It's the second largest city in India after Delhi. It has a population of 20 million plus people, one of the largest, most cosmopolitan cities in the world. But yet I've noticed when there is a flood, when there is COVID, when there is a terrorist attack, unfortunately, the chief minister is the first person who is expected to come. And I don't expect that to happen because the chief minister has 48 plus districts to cover. He can't, or she can't be in Mumbai. But nobody knows who the city's mayor is. And I remember I used to talk to my father about this very often because he was a mayor, and he had a certain profile as a mayor, but again, the powers did not exist at the time. Do you feel some greater devolution of powers wherein a Mumbai mayor becomes maybe elected? Once I had come to meet you, in fact, when you were chief minister, with a campaign for directly elected, directly accountable mayors. Do you think that will help us to have a mayor who is powerful, like a London mayor or a New York mayor, or and some states in India have that? In fact, Tamil Nadu has directly elected mayor, which is why a regional party leader from DMK, Stalin, the son of Karunanidhi. Karunanidhi chose to become a mayor because that means that shows that the post of mayor of Chennai has powers.
Mm-hmm.
Can we create that? And is that possible? Is that advisable? I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
I think
If I may just intervene, because the time is the clock is turning, and now is actually a good time to bringing also our two authors and the audience also. So may I suggest that we take a first round of questions, and then I will certainly would like you, Mr. Fadnavis, to go back on these questions of Mayor, because it is indeed a very important question. But can I ask Pradeep or Harsh to step in back into the conversation, and Aishwarya, perhaps if you could start with maybe 2-3 questions for our speakers. Thank you.
Sure, Jill. Thank you. So I guess, one question we had, and really as an attempt in our book to unravel the personal brand of politics of all the leaders we featured and we spoke with. One thing that stood out to us, say for Milind, for instance, was that he's never afraid of expressing his independent perspective, even if that contradicts with his party's position. And I remember a tweet from the UPA 2 days, which Milind might find embarrassing now, but which said, if Milind says something, can Rahul be far behind? And what we're seeing more recently is that a lot of parties now, you have to really toe the line in terms of the expression of your, expression of the party line rather than expression of your individual sentiment and independent perspective. We saw this not just for the BJP, which people often accuse them of, having a very strict mindset on that front. But even recently, you've had Congress leaders getting removed from the party because of them questioning the leadership or questioning the party organization in some ways. And this is just across parties. What we want to get a sense of is the space for independent voices and dissent shrinking across political parties? And if so, why is that happening? And what can we do to change that?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, please.
Sure. Firstly, I mean, I think that I've never strayed away from a party view in terms of a core ideological view, but on issues of governance, on issues of development. So let's say, for instance, should Air India be privatized, for instance? I have a very strong opinion about some of these issues. And I think on peripheral issues, Harsh, I see no harm, and I think it's true of any party, regardless of how disciplined or how freewheeling a party allows you to be, to take stands which may be a little different. Unless you are a party spokesperson, then you have to be very, very disciplined, and then your voice is the gospel voice, so to speak, of the party. And so, for example, a person like me, I could never really be my party's spokesperson because I am very free, free in my mind and my views, at least on peripheral issues, to comment on those things. But I think it depends on the post you have. If you are a minister in the government in a particular government, you obviously have to be a little more responsible because you're part of what they call collective responsibility. If you're a spokesperson of a party, you have to be very, very responsible. But if you're an ordinary MP or a member of a party, I think that all parties should encourage that sort of inner party democracy and external democracy. I see no harm in that. I think that even though the United States has only 2 major parties, there are still very, very different stands within Democrats and Republicans. And that's healthy for a democracy, ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Aishwarya, would you like to submit a couple of questions from the audience? And if they are directed to a particular speaker, do mention that as well.
I shall do that. In fact, I'd just like to thank everybody who's all the attendees who've been here with us for nearly over an hour today. And Mr. Fadnavis and Mr. Deora, it's been an absolute pleasure to watch 2 politicians from different ideological backgrounds have such a camaraderie and such a balanced conversation. And to Harsh and Professor Chibber, I must tell you that you've received a lot of congratulatory messages and good wishes. And on that note, I'm going to ask you, it's a kind of a general question, though I think Mr. Fadnavis and Mr. Deora will be better placed to answer it. And it's a very hopeful question, if I may say so. Vivek asks, what might be disruptive policies for India tomorrow?
I think Devendra ji, why don't you take that first?
No, I think basically, if we look at tomorrow's India, the biggest challenge before us now post-COVID is economy, and we will have to face a lot of challenges because of the situation which we are facing due to COVID. But I think it also gives us an opportunity. And I think the mantra given by our Prime Minister, vocal for local, is something which can rebuild our economy. I think the best decision which this government has taken is banning around maybe 125 products into defense manufacturing from importing. I think that is best decision, because until you have faith in yourself that yes, we can make it, you won't be able to replace it. So I think the greatest disruption post-COVID would be to make a self-sufficient, self-reliant India. And for that, we need to have a lot of faith in ourselves that we can make it, we have ability to do it.
I would also tell Vivek the same thing, that I mean, the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity for India, without a doubt, is the economy going forward. And I think India is well poised on multiple levels. I think from in a technology space, for instance, there are great innovations in the future that can come out of India. We will have to look at reinventing our economy, reducing our dependence perhaps on certain sectors that may become irrelevant after COVID. But I think that if you look at artificial intelligence, the industry of AI labelers, that is a huge employment generator to start with. And I think Indian tech companies, BPO companies, IT-enabled companies can very easily replicate that success and become, in a sense, the AI labeling hub for the world, because that's something which will create a lot of jobs, and that's the world trusts us. It requires skills, again, like English. I think also a big area, I wouldn't say it's a disruptive area, but in addition to tinkering policies and reducing our dependence on certain imports which make us unproductive, I do believe that creating and enlarging and enhancing our manufacturing base is of critical and strategic importance in our country. And that in time will start to happen. If you look at what's happening with 3D printing, for instance, 3D printing was essentially for aeronautical designs, for metals, to some degree even for foods. And now you're seeing startups in the United States, in Western democracies, in Europe, who are beginning to 3D print even shoes and t-shirts. And they're printing 3D shoes from recycled material like plastics. Now, if that takes off, you will see manufacturing coming back home. What that will also do is that will also reduce the world's dependence, let's say, on a country like China's. And that will allow India to become far more self-sufficient, to grow its manufacturing as a percentage of its overall GDP, and ultimately create jobs here.
Thank you. Would you have anything else to add, Mr. Fadnavis or Mr. Deora, or shall I take the next question?
No, you can take the next question. Please go ahead.
All right. So this is a question that kind of is attempting to understand how the party works, or how members of the party work or are treated at the grassroots level. So Ganesh asks, how do you see the role of Karyakartas in your political activities, and how do you take care of them? Many times these Karyakartas are used during election campaigning but disbanded in between two elections. So how do you help them in their everyday livelihood?
See, for a political party, Karyakarta is the oxygen of political party. You know, they are the real foot soldiers, and I mean, any party, it can win election on the basis of Karyakartas. It can connect itself with the general public on the basis of karyakartas. So I think they are something which we feel that we have to treat them well. And so far as the karyakartas in BJP are concerned, I think we value them. We value them a lot. So it's not just that we use them at the time of elections, but 24/7, the karyakartas are with us. They are part of our family. And we also, look at them as members of our family. So if they have some problems in their family, or if they have some personal problems, they come to us and we try to help them, or we also reach out to them. So I think that no political party will survive if it only uses its karyakartas for election and then forgets the karyakartas after election.
I would agree, and I would second Devendraji's point. I would just make one more additional, slightly contrarian observation, that I do believe that India's electoral process and political process is evolving in a way that if you look at the United States, for instance, if you ask a Democratic senator, he or she doesn't really have karyakartas. There are no Democratic workers as such. They are people, everyday people who are working in a company, they have a job, and then they organize themselves together before an election and then go back to their job. And I think what's beginning to happen is, like Devendraji said, that the hardcore karyakartas who are in a particular party, whether it's in Congress or in BJP or in any other party, who are there for the ideology, who are there to work and contribute, who are also there to advance their careers, that forms the integral part of a political machine. But in addition to that, today we're seeing elections where you also have volunteers coming in, augmenting the efforts of the karyakartas during an election period, and then disbanding and going back to their own jobs. I don't know if you'll agree with that, Devendraji, but I'm starting to see a lot of that happening now in Indian politics.
I totally agree. And I've seen a lot many people who are actually very much interested in working for a party only during election time.
Right.
They come to party to work for the elections without any expectation, just for the sake of ideology, or just for the sake of their love for the leader, and they go back after that.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, Mr. Deora, is there anything else you'd like to add?
That's all.
That's it. All right. So when I decided to moderate this session, I told myself I wouldn't be biased in terms of what questions to ask. I'm not biased. I promise you, I'm picking questions that are representative of other questions as well to avoid redundancy. But I am biased towards this one particular question. And Anindita and so also Aman have this question to ask to both of you. What piece of advice would you give to the youth, especially young women, to feel encouraged to take part in politics today?
Maybe Milind can start.
My advice to women to take part in politics today, I mean, I would say that again, politics is not, unfortunately, has not been as welcoming to women as I'm sure Devendraji and I and parties, regardless of which party is in power, would have wanted it to be. Different governments, different political parties have different ways of tackling that. Some feel that reservation is absolutely important in parliament. In a state like Maharashtra, for instance, at a municipal level, so in the Nagpur Municipal Corporation, where Devendraji served as a corporator and mayor, and in the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, there are 50% seats at a local level reserved for women. Having said that, I must admit and tell you the best kept secret of politics. A lot of the people who become corporators are often wives of politicians and sitting corporators whose ward has now become reserved for a woman. And then they feel their wife or their sister or their daughter or their mother. And that's fine. That's part of politics. Nevertheless, women still do get in. But I think that more than reservation, we really need to make politics a more welcoming place for women. And I think there are great models in the world for us to emulate. If you look at a country like New Zealand, if you look at Scandinavian countries, which I'm very familiar with, a small country I visited many a times and have studied their political model very closely, Iceland. You look at Norway. These countries have a history of remarkable political leadership led by women. And these countries have demonstrated that when women are in positions of power, not just as legislators, but in executive positions, the country's economy is better managed, the country's foreign policy is better managed, the country's social sector, its hospitals and schools are better managed, and the country has a more compassionate attitude towards its citizens. So my message to women would be that certainly I'm not going to lie and say that politics is an amazing place for women. It's tough. It's tough for a man. For a woman, I'm sure it's going to be harder. But I think India is doing, again, is making remarkable strides in making it better for women. But we really need to focus on emulating what some of our Western neighbors have done, Western countries have done in Europe and even in New Zealand. Because if we can get to half of that, I think we will achieve significant progress, not just for women, but for our country as a whole.
I think I totally agree with what Milind has said. Right now, in recent times, I can see very competent women entering the politics at all levels. And Milind, you are right. Initially, 100% of the women corporators were wives of somebody. But now I could see that 70% corporators who are women are self-made politicians, are not wives of somebody. Right. So this change has happened in last 20 years. And even in the parties, I mean, I'm sure even in your party, you could see that some women who are very competent are coming forward. And right now, I think women are taking very keen interest in politics, which is very good thing. Having said that, it's still totally male dominated, and most of the men feel threatened when women enters politics. So that will always be there for some time. But I think I would advise that it's right time for all aspiring women to come to politics. They have a very good place, and although we will feel threatened, but still you can enter politics.
And the fact that we feel threatened means you're very capable.
Correct.
Thank you for that answer, and especially as a woman myself who's been very curious about how there are so few of us in politics, and as a young person looking at a new India and a new world in the post-corona situation. That thank you for that, asking that question, and thank you for answering that. Unfortunately, I hope most of you will not accuse me of not asking your questions. We are running woefully out of time, and we have received some phenomenal questions from 30 people, 40 people, but very sorry that I can't take all of them because we're hard pressed for time, and I must hand it over to Professor Gilles to wrap up the session. And thank you, Mr. Fadnavis. Thank you, Mr. Deora, for answering these questions.
Thank you.
Gilles, can I ask a question?
Actually, you know, I was about to say that those of us who know Pradeep and those who know who've attended his colloquium at Berkeley know very well that what he likes best to do is to stand at the back of the room, like sort of he's doing now in the corner, not say anything, watch the proceedings, and actually end the conversations with, you know, 2-3, you know, killer lines that sort of sets the tone and of the debate. So there is actually one question I have for you, Pradeep, because and Harsh, because most political figures you interview in the book, barring maybe 4, maybe 5, were not born outside politics. So I wanted to ask you whether that was intentional, whether that is coincidental, or is it just reflective of a state of affairs in India that most of India's lasting political class is bound to remain dynastic? And I know the argument that not everyone is a dynast, but if you look at those who last in politics, those who have extended careers, those who occupy high positions in executives or within their organizations, tend to be far more dynastic than the larger population of elected representatives. And in a way, maybe with the exception of Jignesh Mivani, which you also interview in the book, all the political figures that are included are all, you know, kind of elite in their own ways. Some, like Mr. Fadnavis, started locally, but Mr. Fadnavis also has a political background. Milind's background, of course, is publicly known and so forth. So maybe I'd like to have some of your thoughts on that, on the elite character of India's political class, and then give you the liberty to close the conversations in any way you like.
Harsh, you want to go first?
Sure. So Jeel, to answer your question, I think the way it started off was, to answer your question directly, it is representative. We wanted to make our list of 20 politicians representative of the fabric of India's political class. And when you look at that, you do find them coming from an elite background, and you do find a lot of them being dynasts. Having said that, our process was very iterative. So we would start with a list of 30 or 40. We would constantly be changing it. And what we found when we interacted with many of the dynasts was that while they've had privileges to start with, a lot of them have had to sacrifice a lot as well. And there was a lot of sacrifice going into their becoming of politicians, but also sustaining as politicians. And we found a lot of character in those stories, and we thought it'd be nice to tell those stories as well. So just to throw a figure at you, 6 of the politicians that we've interviewed in this book lost their fathers at a very young age, some of them in violent assassinations. Many of them have had to sacrifice things at a very early age. Many of them have had family issues growing up or later on in their lives. And many of them more recently, and Milind being one of them, have even had to lose their seats that people so often accuse them of having, got their seats handed on a platter. Many of them have lost their seats and constituencies as well. Talking about those issues, and especially for politicians with a privileged background, was in some ways fascinating for us and hopefully for the readers as well. But now I'll hand it over to Pradeep to give his killer last line.
No, I don't have any question. I actually will take a different point of view, and I agree with Jeel. I'm a political scientist, so pardon me, Devendra ji and Milind. I think that Indian politics is unusual in the sense that when you speak to people, and this is what's going on, and that Indian politics is unusual because India is one of the few countries where the political parties are controlled by dynasts, which is extremely unusual. There are exceptions. But there are more dynasts in the parliament, as many people may know, in places like Japan, in Philippines, and Indonesia. There are many more dynasts than we do in parliament. But most countries don't have political parties being controlled by dynasts. And I think, to my view, and I'm going to cross a line here, I think it has to do with the role of money and careers in building political lives. And I think that becomes important. And therefore, it's better to keep some things within the family than to have a much wider and a structured organization. So I think that's the first thing. The other thing, which is more deeply disturbing, purely intellectually, is that when we were coming up with the list, we would ask people who are the politicians we would talk to. And you realize that the people who have managed to come to power are disproportionately dynasts. And these are the politicians who we as a society are considered to be leaders, right? So that's a cultural element to this, which I think we need to be cognizant of and think about harder. I don't have a good answer to any of these things, but those are things I'd like for all of us to think about. But we are coming to the end of this, and I just want to ask, this is not a question, this is something I noticed when we interviewed both Mr. Fadnavis and Mr. Deora. There are people with an extremely positive attitude. But politics is also for the paranoid, which means you're always afraid that somebody is going to take your seat. So this is a question I want you to think about. How do you manage to be positive and paranoid at the same time?
I would just say you have to have a healthy, you really have to ask yourself every single day what you're in this for. And I know a lot of people who are dynasts, myself included, who frankly, if I step away from politics, nothing will change. I don't have some family ancestral properties for which I need to be in politics. And there are people who do have that issue. There are people who do need to stay in politics to survive. So if you're really in it for the right reasons, because you really want to serve, then frankly, you're kind of detached to it. If power comes, great, make the most of it, do your best. If it's not there, you're not going to be upset or frustrated or depressed or anything.
Mr. Fadnavis.
So I would say for me, positivity is a God's gift. So, I mean, I cannot be negative at all. I just cannot think negative, and that has helped me to come here. I mean, as rightly told by Milind, when I was a chief minister, even when people from opposition used to come to me, I've never sent them back just because they are from any other party. Because what I feel is that you have to be positive, you have to do what you can, and that gives you back. So, I mean, I would say that it is only because of my positivity that I could retain my position in politics. So I don't have to be paranoid because I'm positive.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. We have to draw this conversation to an end. I really want to thank you, heartily, Mr. Fadnavis and Milind, not only for the content of the conversations, but for showing, what a cordial, civil, political discussion, look like. And I hope a lot of your colleagues take cue of, the manner in which, many, in fact, political leaders actually conduct themselves. And this was quite exemplary and enlightening. Thank you very much, Harsh and Pradeep. Once again, congratulations for putting these very insightful interviews together. Many thanks for the CPR to host this conversation, and of course to my colleagues, Aishwarya, and to the audience as well. I wish you all a very good evening. And Pradeep, have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. And congrats again, Pradeep and Harsh. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you, Milind. Thank you for everything. Seriously. Take care. Bye-bye.